Today in class, or on our lectures, we're going to be talking about the first half of 23 of chapter 23, which is the 17th century art. Chapter 3 focuses on the 17th century art in all of Europe, but for the purposes of our videos and our timeline, I'm splitting it up into two sections. So this first section is going to focus just on Italy and Spain, and our next section will focus on sort of the rest of Europe in the 17th century. So we're going to focus on this area down here of modern day Italy and this area over here in Spain. You'll notice that the area of Italy and Spain are the same color. That's because parts of Italy are being run by Spain. This map is divided into what the countries looked like in the 17th century. You can see France is pretty much recognizable as the kingdom or territory of France that we know now. There's an area in here that you'll see is also run by Spain. It's the same shade of blue. Over here we have the German states. For part of it, they're still really known as the Holy Roman Empire, but you can see that different areas are now sort of splitting off. We're going to discuss the independence of the Dutch Republic and what that's going to mean, and for the rest of the world. Chapter 23 is divided not only by culture, by what culture is running what area, but chapter 23 in the art is also going to be explicitly divided up based on the religion of the area. We're going to see that the religion of that particular territory has a lot to do with what the art looks like. We talked about this in our last chapter. The two main religions that we're dealing with now are Catholicism, still the primary and the most popular, Catholicism, and the different Protestant faiths. The most popular is Lutheranism, and that's becoming popular in all of the German states, especially the Dutch Republic, that you see right here. And then another version of Protestantism, which is the Anglican Church, which is over here in England, but we're not really going to talk too much about England today. We're focusing on, for the first half of the chapter, Spain and Italy. And so you could probably guess that the first half of our chapter is going to be focused on Catholicism and the art that's coming out of these still very Catholic territories. Spain is still very, very Catholic, and Italy, of course, is going to remain very, very Catholic. Protestantism does not catch on in Italy, probably because of its geographical central locality next to the Pope. Overall, the 17th century art gets the term Baroque. European art is typically described as Baroque, which is comes from the Portuguese word barroco, which you have in your handout definition there. Barroco means an irregularly shaped pearl. This is a barroco. You may have seen them on some jewelry. They're pearls that come out of these oysters and they look irregular. They're not perfectly round. Usually pearls are perfectly round. The term Baroque is kind of problematic because we're going to see that the term Baroque does not really encompass, or the style of Baroque art was not being produced everywhere in Europe during the 17th century. We're going to see the Baroque style mainly in areas of Italy and Spain and areas of Catholicism, whereas other areas in the world like the Dutch Republic, which we're going to study, and areas of Germany, we still call their art Baroque and their Baroque in period, but you're going to see that they're definitely not Baroque in style, but that won't be until next week. The other reason that the term Baroque is problematic is because it was first used in the late 18th and early 19th century by art critics who were comparing the 17th century European art with that of the Renaissance. If you look at a Renaissance masterpiece next to a piece from the 17th century in Europe, you kind of you'll actually start to see it. The Baroque example will look much more irregular and lumpy, if you want to use a non-very professional term, but you can. It's lumpy. It looks lumpy compared to the Renaissance art, which is always very well composed, and the composition was always mapped out perfectly. So we'll look at several examples comparing Baroque to the Renaissance. The main sort of characteristics that you'll see from this chapter, from this section on Baroque from the Catholic regions is that it's going to embrace dynamism, theatricality, ornamentation, so we're going to see lots of opulence, and the spectacular. If you ever look at a piece of art and you feel totally overwhelmed by the composition or by the opulence of it, odds are good that you're looking at an example of Baroque art. Because most of Baroque art is going to, the Baroque art, at least that we're covering today, comes from these Catholic regions, they're going to be intensely focused on their Counter-Reformation movement. So trying to keep the Protestant Reformation from getting too powerful and stealing too many of their followers. So the Protestant Reformation obviously caused the Counter-Reformation. Effort in the Catholic Church. We're going to still talk about that Council of Trent, which insisted on the necessity of images to teach the laity, and the necessity of making sure that those images reflect the Catholic doctrine. So Baroque art, especially the stuff that's being produced by and for churches, is going to be very didactic, meaning that it's going to try to teach you something, and that teaching is usually about the miracles of Christianity. As far as politics are concerned, you kind of see in this map some of these battles that are going on. The main war that happens between 1618 and 1648 is the 30 Years' War, which we talked about a little bit at the end of our last chapter. The 30 Years' War is the war for the Dutch Republic's independence, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The 30 Years' War, however, does end with the Dutch Republic gaining their independence from Spain. So this area here, basically modern-day Brussels, stays with Spain. They stay Catholic. The Dutch Republic is now going to be Protestant. So it's really interesting that right next to each other, they're going to be practicing two very different religions and producing very different styles of art. The Treaty of Westphalia, or the Peace of Westphalia, as you have on your handout, is going to validate the religious freedom and the Protestant Act. So it's now, at least in the Dutch Republic and in most of the German states, legal to be Protestant. So it's illegal then to persecute someone for being Protestant. Also, the Peace of Westphalia recognizes the Dutch Republic as an independent state from Spain. Despite the Dutch Republic's gained independence, we're going to see that for the most part, the major powers in Europe are run by kings. And these rulers, especially towards the end of this century, are going to start to exercise absolute power. So there's going to be, well, a king in Spain. There already is a king in Spain. There's already a king in France. There's already a king in England. And they're going to be expanding their powers and their empires. Definitely, well, a queen in Austria, but we'll talk about her later, and in Sweden, which has invaded Russia again. We call this period the Age of Absolutism. Age of Absolutism because rulers are exercising absolute power. They're also taking off for new worlds, especially over here in Portugal and Spain. They're setting their sights across the ocean, expanding their empire that way, and discovering America. You can probably assume, or you probably already have assumed, that during the Counter-Reformation, the church is going to be throwing a lot of money at churches. With this renewed energy of the Counter-Reformation, wanting to exert their authority and showing off their power and their dominance, which is interesting because throwing money at churches was exactly what caused the Protestant Reformation in the first place. So it's almost as if they were... They saw the Protestant Reformation and they said, we're just going to keep doing it. This is one of the earliest manifestations of the Baroque spirit. Carlo Maderno is one of the first architects to work in this true Baroque style. So you probably can already recognize parts of this facade as coming from that Alberti and Palladio temple facade that we looked at, right? You have two separate rows, a temple on the bottom, well, almost a full temple on the bottom, but definitely a temple on the top with a triangular pediment, and then the side aisles connected by these very familiar to Alberti looking scroll decorations that we saw. However, the Baroque is going to be very irregular compared to the Renaissance. Whereas in the Renaissance, especially this one by Alberti, you had of regularity. The columns were pretty much evenly spaced. You had, one solid column here, one solid column here, one solid column here, one solid column here. And they're pretty much evenly spaced. Same goes for the top. It had to be a little bit further apart because of this rose window, but you get the idea. You can talk about architectural rhythm. We've talked about volume before, but here I want to discuss rhythm. When you read a facade of a church, try to sort of sound out the facade to yourself. A Renaissance church will sound like bum, 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 because of each of the columns that you see making that large note. Whereas a Baroque church, if you start to look at, there's a lot more intricacy and a lot more irregularity. It starts with two square plasters on the outside, one square plaster here, pilaster, not plaster, pilaster, a engaged column, and then two quick engaged columns next to each other, a door, two quick engaged columns, another engaged column, and a pilaster. So if you were to read this, it would go bum, 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 bum. It would have a much different rhythm. So that's maybe that's a weird way to do it, but that's kind of the best way that I can show you guys that really makes sense to me, is to sort of equate it to music. So try clapping out the facade. If it starts to have these irregularities like these two columns next to each other, or even these small columns right here, which if you play a musical instrument, you can kind of equate them to grace notes, right? You can definitely tell that you're looking at a Baroque church as opposed to a Renaissance church. A Renaissance will have a very regular beat, and a Baroque church will have an irregular beat. If anyone's familiar with the history of music, the Baroque time period is around the time that Vivaldi starts experimenting with different musical textures and that kind of thing. So you can see it in music as well as in architecture and also in art. It's almost as if they'd just gotten bored of the Renaissance regularity in that beat. The reason for this, what's the reason for all this irregularity? Well, Carlo Maderno said that he believed that the irregularity, sort of building this anticipation in the center, brought the eye's focus towards the center. So sort of building an architectural drama as you gaze at it towards and drawing your eye towards the middle. Pope Paul V, who was at this point in the early 17th century the Pope in Rome, he really liked what Maderno had done for the Il Gesù church that we just looked at. And he thought that it would build, that his particular Baroque style, that his new Baroque style, would build upon Michelangelo's design by adding even more drama and rhythm. So he hired him to finally finish Julius II's plan of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, to finally finish what Michelangelo had started about a century earlier. So the St. Peter's Basilica had stood in a state of incompletion for quite some time. So you can see that the church is finally putting their finishing touches on the building that really started all of this trouble with the Protestants. So once again, they're really asserting their authority, that they do not care what the Protestants have had to say about too much spending within the church, and they're not going to negotiate, and they're not going to tone it down. Certainly not. Carlo Maderno was somewhat tied to the plan of the building itself, which was already semi-constructed, semi-finished. One of the things that Pope Paul V had Carlo Maderno do was drag the front of the church out longwise. So what started out as Michelangelo's centrally planned Renaissance squares and circles love affair church, Carlo Maderno then elongates to make it more of a rectangular basilica. So we'll see it from an aerial view in just a couple of slides, and you'll see what I mean, that they elongate it. Michelangelo would have hated that. Not only were they messing with his original plan, which he never liked when people messed with his original designs, but the elongation of this facade brought it out a lot further, and you can see that the upper level of the face of this church is blocking Michelangelo's beautiful cupola, his beautiful dome that he had constructed. And so he if he would have seen this, he would have been rolling in his grave, but they did it anyway. You can see again this lovely irregularity of the facade with two pilasters on the outside, engaged column, two quick engaged columns, engaged column, engaged column, engaged, two quick ones, another one, and then two pilasters on the other side. Also, fun fact, this bell was never constructed. It broke on its way up the tower, and they never fixed it. And you can climb up to this cupola, so I'll show you pictures of that as well. But first we have to look a little bit at the interior. While Carlo Maderno was working on the facade of the church, a young upstart of a sculptor and architect named Bernini was commissioned and hired to decorate the interior. Most of the interior of St. Peter's Cathedral is original to Bernini. One of his first assignments as the interior designer and interior decorator was for this baldacchino. This is called a baldacchino. It's this bronze massive structure that stands over the altarpiece in front of this little dip down here which was supposed to descend into the catacombs, right over the spot where St. Peter was supposedly buried. Spoiler alert, he's not under there. He was thrown into the Tiber River. Sorry, everybody, but he's not down there. It's bronze. It's a massive bronze structure. It was cast in many pieces and then assembled and then gilded. So the bronze is this natural sort of bronze color. And then you can see the gold here is from the gold leaf that he applied over it. You can see more of this irregularity in these wonderful spiral columns. The Renaissance would have hated these spiral columns. They're so irregular. They're so not Greek or Roman looking. They're so unique in their shape and irregular in their design. And so again, you can hopefully start to really see why the Baroque gets its name from these irregularly shaped pearls. I mean, even just in these columns themselves. Then he goes a step further by adding a spiral decoration to the bottom of the columns and then a floral decoration to the top of the columns, and then these really elaborate, we would call them composite column capitals, sort of a combination of Ionic and Corinthian column capitals. It's entirely bronze, so even this canopy looks like cloth. It's actually bronze, as well as the statues on the top are bronze statues, again created by Bernini. The purpose of his baldacchino, his massive structure here, was to draw attention and focus attention from, it's actually located directly under the cupola, so draw attention down from this vast dome over the altar. Also, if you look at an alternate view here, you can see the cupola. Let me get rid of this. You can see that the cupola expertly frames this chair. And this throne back here is the Pope's throne, which Bernini also designed. He sculpted and carved. He added this window. He added these gilded bronze rays of light that come out of the window and would be located right over the Pope's chair. Really stunning Baroque masterpiece. And you can see the theatricality of incorporating window space and light into the sculpture, into the structure, and the drama of the Baroque period just really emphasized here. You're not going to walk into this area and see someone sitting on this chair and think that they were of no importance. Here's an aerial view of some of the other work that Bernini was commissioned for. This picture was taken from the cupola, looking out across the square. And so this is the piazza that's located outside of St. Peter's Cathedral. If you go to see St. Peter's or Vatican City, you would wait in line out here while you go through metal detectors before you can get into the church. This exterior area with these arms that extend across was a design by Bernini. So Carlo Maderno was finishing up the facade. Meanwhile, Bernini gets the commissions for basically the interior and the piazza. A piazza, I should say, is a term for a square. And by square, though, I mean a public square, not square shape. Many squares are square, but this is one of those exceptions. This is an oval. He designed them, and many people said that what he was designing was supposed to be representative of the open arms of the church, but that's just not true. The truth is that they kind of ran out of money, and so they stopped short of completing the circle, and then they decided that they liked it better that way anyway, because it draws a lovely little processional route down here to Castle Sant'Angelo, which is where the Pope used to hide when they got invaded. In true spirit of the Baroque period, they're going to reject the Renaissance's love affairs with squares and circles, and instead Bernini is going to give us ovals. In the square itself is oval shaped, and trapezoids. You can see that the arms here cut in to form a trapezoid shape if I draw it all the way across, instead of just a square. Oh, also, I should state for fun, this is an obelisk that was brought over from Egypt by Augustus, who's buried right over here somewhere. And they moved it from his tomb to outside St. Peter's Basilica, and they put a cross on top of it. Although it's an obelisk from Egypt, it has Egyptian hieroglyphs on it and everything. Here's a better aerial view. You can see all the tour buses lined up out here. They're not allowed to park there anymore. But here you can see where they brought the church out a bit longer than it was originally supposed to be. It was originally supposed to cut off like right around here so that it would be squares and circles, and you would really see this dome. Whereas in the last picture we looked at, all we really saw was this top part of the dome. We didn't see Michelangelo's brilliant drum that he rests the dome on, which is located right down here with all of these double columns. Again, Michelangelo was very close to the Renaissance, he was very close to the Baroque. Bernini and Moderna were highly influenced by his work. And this is the Pope's apartment. So if you ever go, you can gaze in the window and see if you can spot the Pope. He's not usually home, though. Yes, Bernini did a lot of work for churches. Yes, he was an architect, a bronze sculpture artist, a marble sculpture artist, and he had a huge part to play in the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral and St. Peter's Basilica. However, he was also an artist that you could hire for personal and family commissions. Bernini worked very closely with the Borghese family, which were a Italian family, independent, right, secular family. I mean, they were Catholic still because they were living in Italy. But they looked for commissions that were not always necessarily just for the church. And it's for these sort of more private commissions that Bernini gets to execute more of his artistic style. So this is one of those pieces that we're looking at. It's called Bernini's David. It is supposed to be David from the David and Goliath statue. The style period is, of course, Baroque, and the culture is Italian. In this example, you can really see the departure from the Renaissance. When I teach this in person, I usually like to have an open discussion of a compare and contrast between Bernini's David statue and Michelangelo's David statue. But because I'm lecturing on video, I just have to explain it to you guys on my own. Although you can probably already start to formulate an opinion about the differences between the Renaissance and the Baroque on your own. Irregularity, right? That's a big word that we associate the Baroque period with. The Baroque term means irregular shaped pearl. So, whereas in Michelangelo's David statue, he's standing in this very calm and relaxed contrapposto pose that we learned about, Bernini's statue is caught up in more of this dynamic pose. He's using a lot of dramatic movement, which is another characteristic of the Baroque art. He's not standing there composed, but he's caught in the action. He has a lot more of a dramatic expression on his face, whereas in Michelangelo's sculpture, he's kind of, we talked about how he was potentially staring down his foe, but we really don't see him looking very overwhelmed. We're certainly not scared or anything like that. In Bernini's, he's exerting a lot of effort. And we go back a couple of slides, we could see that close-up of his face, where he's biting his lip and furrowing his eyebrows. So we see a lot more dramatic emotion, as well as a more dramatic movement and irregular positions, not just standing in contrapposto. We also see more of this theatricality. When you stand in front of Michelangelo's David, yes, we think he might be looking out at his enemy, but there's nothing that really truly draws our eye away from Michelangelo's David. When you're standing in front of Bernini's David, you almost get this feeling like you need to look behind you, because there might be some kind of monster there that you haven't seen before. So that's really key too, this sort of dragging the viewer into the moment and bringing you into the theatricality of the scene is another characteristic of Baroque art. Also, whereas Michelangelo's work was produced to be placed inside of a sculptural niche, now you can circle it, but it wasn't originally designed to do so, you need to circle around a Bernini sculpture. You need to walk around it to see what's happening, and you need to get up right close to it to see all of the spectacular detail. He really has a fantastic way with the marble of getting the marble to look and react and behave like real human flesh. He polishes it, he uses drills, he uses texture. He studied anatomy very, very strongly. You can see that they're still following this, anatomical studies of the body. He gets everything from the veins to the ribs to the side muscles to small details like this fold here and his armpit hair that's slightly sticking out. I mean, it's just spectacular, and it's even more impressive when you see it in person. Size-wise, I forgot to say this when we were doing the compare and contrast, but size-wise, Bernini's David is more or less life-size, maybe a little bit larger, whereas obviously Michelangelo's David we discussed was 17 feet tall. Also, another thing you might have noticed in comparing and contrasting, Bernini's David is not nude. So technically, yes, this was done for a independent art patron, the Borgheses. But during this Counter-Reformation movement, the church has stopped looking so fondly at the nude statue. Whereas nudity was a humanism statement during the Renaissance, during the Baroque period, they're in the Counter-Reformation movement, they're not going to show anything like that. That was, somewhat controversial, or no nudity, especially. I also like that this includes a couple more realistic details. For example, here he's holding his slingshot with the rock in it, so he's really aiming forwards. He's kind of caught in this movement right before his dramatic action. But I like that he has this bag with him. This would have held other rocks. So this Bernini, this David statue is not entirely sure that he's going to get him with the first shot. He has a couple extra rocks in there, which I think is a reality to the story that he probably would have had a couple extra rocks. I mean, because who knows? This marble statue would not have been painted. This was designed to be a marble, to be left white marble. Bernini did continue to do other church commissions. This is his St. Teresa of Avila in Ecstasy, which was created for the Coronaro Chapel of the Santa Maria della Vittoria church in Rome. He sets up the entire chapel as a theater, similar to the chair that we studied from the Vatican cathedral. He works into his statue the background. He built a window up in this upper area up here, which we can't see because I don't have a good picture for you guys. But up here there's a window to shine light down on his statue. He arranges the theatricality of the entire thing. This is a great example of a Counter-Reformation work of art. It really emphasizes this dramatical, mystical interaction between a Catholic individual and the holy or the religious. So St. Teresa was a nun. She was a nun living in a convent, and she was, when she was sleeping one night, she had a dream where she was transverberated. A transverberation in referring to Catholic art was that she was shot in the heart by an arrow by the Holy Spirit, delivered by an angel. And she said in her later description of the miracle, in her later description of the Holy Vision, that it was both an agony and an ecstasy, and that she was, filled with the divine light of the Holy Spirit. So it's playing up this mystical interaction for the viewer. It's eroticized exaltification of the Catholic faith through the mystic saints. Nowadays, it's been sort of termed somewhat controversial because her expression, and if you see it up close, it does seem to be more focusing on the ecstasy rather than the agony. But at the time, the Catholic Church would have loved it because the example of a transverberation was something of a miracle that could happen to anybody who practiced their faith closely enough. It was also seen as a reward. So St. Teresa here is being transverberated by this angel who's stabbing her. And again, you can talk all about Bernini's mastery of the marble that he uses. Moving from St. Teresa back to another work that he created for the Borghese Gallery. This is Bernini's Rape of Persephone. in ancient terms, they often use the term rape to mean abduction. So not necessarily just the sexual encounter, although sometimes the sexual is implied. In this case, it's just really talking about the abduction. Persephone, or also known as Proserpina, was the daughter of Demeter, also known as Ceres, and she was skipping in the woods one day, or skipping through the field one day, when Pluto, also known as Hades, god of the underworld, noticed her and decided to kidnap her. Her mom goes down to try to save her. She eats a pomegranate. She has to live there 6 months out of the year, and that's why we have seasons. This whole story that we just talked about is a story from Greek and Roman mythology. There is a resurgence in interest in Greek and Roman mythology, which we saw obviously happening in a big way during the Renaissance, but art was still primarily focused on Christianity. Here, because Bernini is working for the Borgheses, once again, he doesn't need to include or worry about the Council of Trent for this particular commission, and he just uses classical stories for his inspiration. The classical story of of Pluto and Proserpina, or Hades and Persephone, came from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid was a first century poet. Some of you guys might have had to read some of his poetry if you ever took a mythology class or sort of a general education class where you learned about mythology. Most of what we know about mythology comes from his book, Metamorphoses. And his book, as the title suggests, includes a lot of stories of people changing from one thing to another. So here you see, again, this excellent use of his marble, the way that you need to circle around a Baroque statue. You can't just stand in front of it, because over here, if you just look at it from this angle, you wouldn't necessarily see the inclusion of Cerberus, Hades' three-headed dog who guards the underworld. Also served as inspiration for the three-headed dog from Harry Potter. He also includes some funny jokes in his work, especially for his work that was for sort of private patrons, not for the church. For example, I don't have a good picture of it, but Pluto has a mole on his butt cheek. And it's one of those things that, like, he had to leave it there on purpose, thinking, good, I'm going to leave this mole. And people who are rotating around the statue are going to be like, how come Pluto has a mole on his butt? And it's going to make people sort of snicker. And then you look at a detail like this, which is just exquisite. And I can't go into enough sort of gushing details about how excellent a marble sculptor he is and how great he was at getting marble to behave like flesh and to look like flesh. Because it can be very tempting when you're working with a stone and to just have his fingers resting on top of the skin. It takes a real, a true observer of humans and the way our bodies work to understand that if someone's picking someone up, then their fingers would dig into the flesh a little bit. Another one of his masterpieces, this is Apollo and Daphne, and it's also in the Borghese Gallery, so it's also for the Borghese family, and it's also inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses. Daphne was a wood nymph. Apollo gets a crush on her, and so he starts chasing her through the woods. Greek myths had a problem with being sort of very rapey a lot of the time, and she doesn't want any part of it, so she prays, and the goddess comes and she saves her by turning her into a laurel tree. And so here she is in the process of metamorphosizing, of changing into a tree. So her toes are growing roots down here. You see her body starting to ossify, right? Or, well, whatever you would say, dendrify, turning into wood, and her fingers are sprouting leaves. And she's almost as surprised about turning into a tree as she is about the fact that she's about to get caught. So here's Apollo chasing her. And he hasn't quite realized that she's a tree yet. But I love her expression. And obviously the amazing way that he's getting the texture to switch from hands to wood to leaves is wonderful. Francesco Borromini, an architect, starts to work even more with this idea of texture in his churches and this idea of rhythm in his churches. So definitely irregular. He goes as far as to create these small waves in his facade. The facade comes in and out. Again, building on this irregularity and building on this drama, focusing the attention to the center. So this is one of his church facades. You can't get a good picture of it because right across the street is an apartment building. So you can't get a very good shot of it from the front. You have to look at it from an angle like this. He also expands and experiments with dome architecture. This is his dome for San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, which means St. Carlo of the Four Fountains. And his dome here is oval. So remember, the Renaissance was all about squares and circles. The Baroque is going to be about irregular shapes like trapezoids and ovals. So here he's using an oval dome.